Hey folks, this is Riker, and now that the dust has settled after an awesome campfire chat revealing Season 5 yesterday, some people who have taken a closer look at the patch notes are realizing it isn't all sunshine and roses. Elden Ring's expansion released this week, there's an awesome new planet in Helldivers 2, and Nintendo Direct revealed some new titles, including a Zelda game with summoner minion gameplay. We'll talk about all that, but first in Diablo 4 news. We got yesterday again the campfire chat revealing details about Season 5, and man, is it looking good. We're getting a new endgame mode, some fantastic quality of life improvements, over 50 new unique items and aspects, and more great changes as well. Check out my video going over all the details right here. But in short, we're getting, again, a new game mode, new endgame, wave-based. It's called Infernal Hordes, and in this mode, after every wave, we get to pick from one of 3 boons and buffs that are going to apply to all subsequent waves to increase the challenge and the reward. And there's an all-new boss fight at the end against the Diablo 2 Travancore Council. They're also hugely buffing unique items to make them competitive with Tempering. We're getting the huge quality of life upgrade of being able to just re-summon uber bosses after the fight, rather than have to reset the dungeon all the time. Overall, Season 5 is already looking like a win, right after the D4 team had their biggest win yet with Season 4. If the devs keep cooking like this, D4 is on a fast track to becoming one of the top 3 ARPGs ever. Before we dive into more Diablo 4 news, we got a word from this video's sponsor, Tarisland, a classic MMORPG that you can play on both PC and mobile. In Tarisland, you explore a vast world filled with adventure, puzzles, and, of course, combat. One of the strongest aspects of Tarisland is its diverse classes and specialization system. You can choose from between 9 different classes, each with 2 specializations. Plus, you can create your own unique build with a rich and flexible talent tree system. And there's no cost to respec, so you can make adjustments on the fly, depending on the combat scenario. Another big focus is raids, in which you work with your team to overcome various unique game mechanics and challenge epic level bosses like the Blight Dragon. That's this bad boy right here. Cooperation and strategy are key to getting through raids. Tarisland is a fully cross-platform experience, so you can play anytime, anywhere, swapping between phone and PC. And Tarisland has an exciting event happening right now, the Taris Legendary Dungeon Tournament. Everyone can participate, and the entry threshold is super low. You'll even get rewards just for signing up. So gear up and join the tournament, whether you're on mobile or PC, and show off your skills. Go ahead and give Tarisland a download today using the link in the description, or scan the QR code on screen. Embark on your epic adventure, unleash your unique talents, and raid dungeons anytime, anywhere. Now, back to Diablo news. Outside of the campfire chat, the patch notes also revealed a buff to goblin loot, world bosses becoming more resilient to damage, and then some class balance changes that are leaving people not so enthused about Necromancer, Druid, or Sorcerer. Barb, once again, looks like it'll dominate in Season 5, but Necromancer's got some perplexing nerfs to even their weaker builds. And Sorcerers and Druids are still not seeing nearly enough love to catch up to Barbarians. Now, we'll know for sure when we play on the test server next Tuesday, and if necessary, we'll hopefully be able to put feedback forth to Blizzard to convince them to make some changes. The mid-season patch dropped this week, and there were a number of bugs that it introduced. Due to an issue with the Holy Bolts elixir that was causing game crashes, Blizzard had to temporarily disable the elixir's power entirely. This was fixed in a June 20th hotfix. Oh, and post-nerf, the Holy Bolts elixir is now basically dead for pit runs. I think it's still good for Helltide and such, but it won't carry you through the pit anymore. The Tal Rasha ring was also bugged. It was not properly counting stacks, and thus dealing less damage than it should have been. This was also fixed in the hotfix. And Dariel's Visage was bugged. The Poison Nova was visually happening on the enemy, but the damage was still emanating from the player. Again, the hotfix fixed this. Now, that said about Andy's, it's been discovered that the 2% lifesteal on Andariel's Visage is not operating the way you would expect. You'd figure in the pit against monsters with huge life pools, you'd be leeching a ton of life back, right? Well, there seems to be some mechanic whereby as the enemy level increases, the actual amount of lifesteal decreases exponentially, to the point that it basically does nothing eventually. Now, the biggest change from the patch that everyone feels is how much easier the pit is now. People are estimating that the pit difficulty got nerfed by at least 30 to 40%, meaning you can now push significantly further. But the biggest complaint from the patch comes from Druid and Sorcerer players who feel left behind by this patch. Some are calling for another patch to this patch to show these classes some more love. In particular, they need more damage in more places to have more builds be able to push further in the pit without relying on a gimmick or two. Beyond that, though, people were making wish lists for Season 5 before the campfire chat. A tempering rework really seemed to be something that a lot of people want, probably the most desired thing. While it remains a contentious issue in the community, a lot of people want to see some kind of change to tempering, though exactly what isn't something that we see a big consensus about. Ultimately, though, it revolves around how punishing it is to brick an item. Seems we are not getting a tempering rework in Season 5. We are getting a small buff, however. Items with greater affixes will have additional tempering attempts, so that's something. It's going to be harder to brick a really good item. The devs did express they do want to keep bricking a thing, but they want, or rather they understand that because it's so RNG based, it's frustrating for players, and so they want to look into ways to give us more control over the RNG, but that is a very far future thing. Another thing on people's wish lists was the ability to have the altar respawn at the end of an Uber boss fight, so we can just resummon the bosses. And again, we learned yesterday that we're getting exactly that. Amazing, the technology is there now. Another complaint was tormented bosses dropping yellow items. We learned yesterday that they are addressing that by having them drop more gold instead of rare items. World bosses being irrelevant as a challenge was a complaint. Some people were calling for tormented world bosses. We learned yesterday that Blizzard again is making world bosses more resilient to damage. But here's the real problem with world bosses. The best builds in the game can single-handedly kill them in a few seconds. But for mediocre builds, made by an average player who's not following a build guide, a world boss is a good, challenging difficulty. But no one gets to experience that difficulty because the OP build people come in and just demolish the bosses. So what we really need for world bosses is a solution that lets the OP people get into this tormented world boss fight at a much higher difficulty, but doesn't allow the people on mediocre builds to go into this fight as well. Because if they can, then they'll just enter it and leech off the OP builds, which isn't a good gameplay experience for anyone, not for them, and not for the people that are carrying them, because now if the fight is going to be really difficult and a real challenge for them, then yeah, they're going to be handicapped by people who aren't helping. So how do you accomplish this? How do you separate out people that way? And that's the real challenge. Now you can say something like, okay, you have to have completed a certain pit tier solo in order to access the Tormented World boss. Or maybe you have to farm Tormented World boss keys from higher pit tiers. I don't know, but just adding a harder world boss won't really address the entirety of the issue. And the entirety of that issue, again, is just that enormous disparity in power differential between the OP strongest builds in the game and just like an average build. Another thing on the community wish list, Rebirth. Gosh, I want this so much. In Diablo 3, Character Rebirth was a feature that allowed you to take an existing character and then transform them into a seasoned character by resetting them back down to level 1, mailing all of their gear to the non-season stash. And this feature is even more important in Diablo 4 because we customize our character's appearance in Diablo 4. With only 10 character slots, we're filling up really fast. If you want to keep a character, which you basically have to do now, if you want to bring that character into the season, is you delete the character and then you have to remake exactly that same character appearance. So you have to like remember, okay, what was the exact, number on the face and on the skin color and on the hair and everything. Now, this is not a priority thing, right? This isn't a game-breaking thing, but it's a simple quality of life thing that D3 had that you would expect D4 to also have. And more, an armory continues to be a requested feature. This has been requested for ages. Something that lets you save your build loadout. D4's original vision of a game in which you would not be respeccing constantly at endgame just has not panned out. Respec is pretty affordable. It's just tedious to do. An armory would be a huge quality of life upgrade now. What we've heard from the devs is it's just a big job and maybe one day in the future. So hopefully with Vessel of Hatred, but at this point I'm thinking maybe hopefully by the end of the year. hopefully early 2026. Now, with Gamescom coming up at the end of August, Blizzard is set to have a presence there. In fact, Xbox as a whole will have a huge presence with their biggest booth ever at Gamescom. And they're going to be the only console maker in attendance this year. The list of games that attendees of Gamescom will be able to play includes, among others, Age of Mythology Retold, Avowed, Ara, History Untold, Towerborn, The Elder Scrolls Online, Fallout 76, Diablo 4, Vessel of Hatred, Diablo Immortal, and World of Warcraft: The War Within. Now, in Elden Ring news, Shadow of the Erdtree released this week to amazing critic reviews. On Metacritic, it is the highest rated DLC of all time. As of this recording, it has a score of 95 out of 100 based on 59 critic reviews. Second place now goes to The Witcher 3 Blood and Wine with a score of 92. On OpenCritic, the DLC has a score of 94 out of 100, with 98% of critics recommending it based on 62 reviews. The DLC receives high praise all around, but of note are its great level design, using verticality to densely layer content, and just the sheer quantity of content in the expansion. Some say it's bigger than many full games. Some critics said that it's almost half the size of the playable zone in the lands between. Now, as for the few criticisms that I've seen, they seem to be about reused enemies from the main game, the bonuses in the new areas aren't that great, and the storytelling is less environmental like it normally is and more direct. And that's not even necessarily a bad thing for a lot of people. A lot of people were confused or can't really keep track or understand what the story is, so it'll be easier to do so now. Oh, and in case you missed it, on top of everything new, they also added 5 new hairstyles, so if you're making a new character, be on the lookout for that. Now, in order to access the DLC content, you'll need to have defeated Mohg and Radahn. And if you're looking for any guides for Shadow of the Erdtree, Maxwell.gg has you covered, as they've just unveiled an Elden Ring mini branch. Game director Hidetaka Miyazaki has also been doing the interview rounds, during which he commented on the popular seamless co-op mod for Elden Ring. For those who don't know, you can mod Elden Ring to have true co-op gameplay as opposed to the drop-in co-op that the game naturally supports, where you summon a teammate briefly. That's one criticism that can be leveled at Elden Ring. It's just a bizarre way to handle co-op that doesn't truly satisfy the desires of people seeking a co-op experience. I mean, it's their decision to create that kind of experience, but it's not really a co-op experience. It's really just, okay, you're playing the single-player game, and oh, you need help with something because you can't do it on your own, so you summon in someone. But now people are seeing, oh, there's co-op in this game, and for people who are looking for that real co-op experience, it's kind of a frustrating experience. But when talking about the mod in an interview with PC Gamer, Miyazaki said, quote, "It's definitely not something we actively oppose or want to downplay, wanting to go through the whole game together. In terms of where we were with Elden Ring, it was simply a case of wanting that more loose, casual, drop in, defeat a boss, drop out. It doesn't put any technical restrictions on the player, it just sort of lets them complete this focus and then move on, so to speak. That's not to say we won't consider other ways, like you and your friend played from beginning to end, total co-op. That's not to say we won't consider ideas like that with our future games." Elsewhere in the interview, Miyazaki expressed that he still hasn't made his ideal RPG. He said, quote, "You might say that trying to capture that excitement of those old tabletop games and game books was one facet of making Elden Ring. But I think more than anything, it's just my personal preference when it comes to RPGs and exploring fantasy worlds. So you might see some of my personal idiosyncrasies come into play. I'm still in the process of making my ideal fantasy RPG. While Elden Ring is not quite it, it's pretty close. It's getting close. If Elden Ring is pretty close, I can't wait to see what his ideal fantasy RPG actually is." Then, in an interview with Game Informer, Miyazaki spoke about combat mechanics and how he seems to want to improve upon the combat of Bloodborne and Sekiro in his next games. Within From Software's stable of RPGs, Sekiro and Bloodborne are generally hailed as those with the best swordplay. Miyazaki said of the style of combat, quote, "It's become something much more fluid and active, I think, which was a very defining characteristic of Sekiro, and it's something I've been thinking about since Bloodborne. Perhaps in Sekiro, it appears most obviously, or it's the clearest form that I think that philosophy can embody. And personally, I think there's one more level we can crank it up to and sharpen that and hone in on that mechanic even more. But I think Sekiro was a big turning point." Miyazaki's been cooking for years. If his best work is still ahead of him, well, we're in for a treat. In Helldivers 2 news, after the great balance patch from last week, but after a brief honeymoon phase, the community began to notice a number of new bugs and issues, leaving some players perplexed. For instance, the patch didn't touch ship modules, and yet superior packing methodology broke. Also, I'm not sure if this bug is new or not, but in co-op play, if anyone injects a stim, then anyone who is sprinting at that time gets their sprint interrupted. I think this only works if all players are on mouse and keyboard, but still, perplexing. Well, just a few days later, Arrowhead released a big bug-fixing patch. And the most exciting fix was for the spear, a weapon that has been broken for months now. Unfortunately, a day or two after the patch, the devs put out a PSA. Please avoid using the spear at the moment because it is causing game crashes. Spear is broken forever, spear is finally fixed, and now spear is crashing the game. Poor spear. But back to some good news, we got a new planet biome, and it's basically Dagobah. Big marshy tree planet, and the trees are destructible, very cool. The planet is already becoming a fan favorite. Oh, and remember the review bomb cape idea from the whole Sony debacle? Well, the game director confirmed that they did finish developing that cape. They've just been trying to find the right time to release it. I think that would have been a couple weeks ago at this point, but hey, you do you. Then we also got the Nintendo Direct presentation over the past week, and while there was no news on the Switch 2, we did get some updates on old games and some new title drops. My three highlights were the announcement trailer for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, which is releasing in 2025. It's got to be something they're planning to release alongside the Switch 2 at this point. We got an announcement trailer for Mario & Luigi Brothership, which is launching on November 7th. And we got the announcement trailer for The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, which is basically The Legend of Link. In this one, you play as Zelda. It launches on September 26th, and it's basically a modern 2D Zelda game. They seem to be taking the sandbox style of Breath of the Wild and implementing it into a classic 2D Zelda format. And among Zelda's powers are this new mechanic that lets her create duplicates of objects or monsters in the world, allowing you to create minion builds, but also find creative ways to solve puzzles. It's quite ingenious, and I'm sure will be subject to hilarious amounts of YouTube videos showing crazy, broken nonsense. Then in some quick Cyberpunk 2077 news, we saw some recent leaks of a cancelled DLC that would have prominently featured the moon. Well, technically they're old leaks from the 2021 security breach, but people have dug back into a part of them recently and found a lot of files that suggest a DLC that would have taken place after the main story, set on the moon, and the files include early conceptual images, map data, and basically a lot of pre and early development files. Now, allegedly, the original plan for Cyberpunk was to have 2 DLCs, but because they had to spend so much time fixing the game, that got reduced down to 1 DLC. And apparently the devs originally wanted the moon to be a location you can visit in the base game, but then due to scope creep, they had to cut it to get the game released, deciding to leave it for a DLC. And unfortunately that DLC will never happen now because we know the devs are done with Cyberpunk 2077. But maybe we'll see the moon in the sequel. And that's going to wrap up this week's video. But do be sure to check out last week's video in which we discussed some extra tidbits we mined from some Diablo 4 interviews. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Special thanks to my supporters, and subscribe to join Riku's Raiders for more gaming content.